Hello, good morning, everyone. It is my great pleasure to welcome you this morning here to our webinar to mark the United Nations International Day of Persons with Disabilities, which we are, as Mark has just said, recording. And our friends at the Trinity Co-op have kindly agreed to host the recording. So if you want to have the opportunity to play back or if you were going to see it for the first time because it's too early in the morning or late at night to join us from wherever you're at, watch out for updates on where you can find the video for playback. As Mark said, I'm Lorraine Leeson, and I am the Associate Vice Provost for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion here in Trinity College Dublin. And for friends who are joining us from abroad, can I actually just interrupt myself there to remind everybody to make sure that their microphones are turned off. Quite a bit of noise coming from some quarters. Thank you so very much. Sure. So anyway, what I was saying there is that here in Trinity, we happen to use the word the college to mean the university. It's just one of our little idiosyncrasies, but now you'll know what we're talking about when we use that term. Today, we're marking our second International Day of Persons with Disabilities amid a pandemic. We hear and we see the world talking about getting back to normal, in inverted commas, meaning pre-pandemic life. But I think it's fair to say that the pre-pandemic world was not a fair one. We know that the global COVID-19 crisis is deepening pre-existing inequalities, and it's also exposing the extent of exclusion, and highlighting the work on disability inclusion is imperative now more than ever. People with disabilities, the UN says that they estimate 1 billion people in the world are people with disabilities, and they are one of the most excluded groups in our society and among the hardest hit in terms of the crisis. And even under non-pandemic circumstances, we know that persons with disabilities are less likely to access healthcare, education, employment, and to participate in the community. So we know that an integrated approach is required to ensure that persons with disabilities are not left behind. Oops, the recording button has been hit again, I think there. Staying with the United Nations say that a disability inclusion approach will result in a COVID-19 response and recovery that better serves everyone, more fully suppressing the virus in our COVID times, as well as building back better. It will provide for more agile systems capable of responding to complex situations, reaching the furthest behind first. And core to this, of course, is ensuring the autonomy of disabled people. And I'm using the term disabled people on the advice of disabled colleagues here in college. But we want to make sure that the voices of the autonomy of disabled people is not just respected, but actively promoted. So this morning's session, which focuses on disability inclusion in higher education, lessons from COVID-19, is one that I know will inform our thinking in this regard. And it will provide important food for thought for all of us who want to make sure that higher educational institutions are a place of welcome, a place of belonging. Now, before we move to our first presenter, I have a little bit of housekeeping for us all. This morning, we have sign language interpreting for 2 sign languages, American Sign Language and Irish Sign Language. And this is a very good visual reminder, of course, that sign languages are independent languages. There is no universal sign language, and they are not a manually articulated manifestation of the spoken languages of the country they are found in. That is me coming from deaf studies and wanting to say that to the world at every chance we get. Forgive me. So we will take the approach, in order to facilitate access and ease of visual referencing, to turn our cameras off if we're not presenting. So could I invite you, if you're not a presenter for the moment, to turn your camera off for the moment. For our presenters, I'm going to pop up on your screen when there's a minute left of your presentation time. Again, a little visual reminder of the time. And for our friends joining us from here in college, across Ireland and further afield, a special welcome to the brave souls who are joining us from very early in the morning in North America and very late in the evening, I guess, in Tasmania. If you do have any questions, please feel free to add them in the questions and answers spot in the chat, and we will do our very best to address them. So with all that said, and without further ado, it is my great pleasure to welcome our first presenter, Dr. Joanne Neille from the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. Dr. Neille is a speech and language therapist and an audiologist by profession, and she's employed as a senior lecturer in the Department of Speech Pathology and Audiology at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg in South Africa. She has clinical and research experience working in rural, peri-urban and urban settings, and she has a specific interest in the lived experiences of persons with disabilities. She's strongly committed to capacity building and the empowerment of students, and to ensuring the equalisation of rights and opportunities are met within the sectors of healthcare and education, as well as with micro engagements within the communities. And Dr. Neille is going to talk us through some lessons from COVID, a South African perspective, and we are absolutely delighted and honoured to have you join us. So Joanne, the Zoom room is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen. There we go. Okay, can I just get a sense if you can see from your side? Okay, all right. Oh, sorry. Thank you so much to everybody for this wonderful opportunity to present. It really is an honor to be joining you this morning, this evening, this afternoon, depending on the time difference. But it really is an honor to share some of the findings of two of the projects that I've been involved in over the last 2 years. Also, just a note on my use of terminology. In this presentation, I've chosen to use the term disabled people. However, you will also note that where I've given some descriptions of participants, I have used the term impairment to describe the medical basis of the limitation which participants have experienced, because it contextualizes some of the findings. Before we start talking about how COVID-19 has influenced and affected the experiences of disabled academics and disabled students, I think it's important for us to take into consideration some of the contextual factors which frame today's findings. South Africa is a diverse country with 11 official languages and a wide range of cultures and belief systems. Life experiences continue to be influenced by the legacy of apartheid, and today, 27 years post-apartheid, South Africa is still dealing with challenges imposed by inequality, deprivation, and extreme spatialization of poverty, making it one of the most unequal countries in the world. At present, 34.4% of the working age population are said to be unemployed. Although South Africa has been described as a upper middle income country, its distribution of wealth is uneven, and many people continue to face enormous challenges imposed by poverty, limited access to services, low levels of literacy, and high levels of unemployment. On the picture on the left-hand side of your screen, you see a picture of Table Mountain in Cape Town. Cape Town is one of the most beautiful cities, and is exemplified by wealth and access. On the right-hand side, you see a settlement approximately 10 miles from where the picture on the left was taken. I've included these two photos not only to show disparity, but also to give a sense of some of the living conditions of our students whose voices are being represented in today's presentation. Looking at the landscape of higher education and disability in South Africa, it's acknowledged that apartheid had a negative influence on education and access to information, the effects of which are still felt today. At present, approximately 10% of the adult population are illiterate. Amongst people with disabilities, access to education is particularly difficult for a number of reasons, including lack of awareness, lack of appropriate facilities, lack of late identification, budgetary limitations, and attitudinal barriers. Most recent reports suggest that 23.8% of people with disabilities have no formal education, while 24.6% of disabled people have limited exposure to primary school education. Transformation in the education sector hasn't really focused on disability, and as a consequence, only 5.3% of people with disabilities have access to higher education. This is not a reflection on lack of policy. There are numerous policies which are inclusive and well thought out in the South African context. However, their implementation continues to be problematic. Taking a look at South Africa's response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the country's response was proactive with strict lockdown measures implemented early on in an attempt to slow down the spread of the virus and to give healthcare facilities an opportunity to prepare as best they could. The first case of COVID-19 was identified in South Africa on the 5th of March, 2020. President Cyril Ramaphosa declared a national state of disaster on the 15th of March with restrictions on social movement. And on the 26th of March, we entered into Alert Level 5. Alert Level, which for a period of 37 days. Alert Level 5 restricted public movement, where everybody was requested as far as possible to work from home, and people were only allowed to leave their homes for brief periods for shopping and for medical purposes. Access to public transport was significantly reduced. All schools were closed, universities moved online, and residences were closed. This meant that a large number of students needed to return home to situations that were less than ideal. In many situations, entire families lived in one-bedroom shacks, which did not always have electricity. Access to data and to devices was challenging, and many students experienced difficulties in terms of balancing their duties within the home with the academic work. Although South Africa's response was effective in terms of slowing down the spread of the infection, it certainly did magnify the social, economic, and educational divides within communities. For the two projects which I'm going to be describing some of the findings of today, one of which is an interdisciplinary and interinstitutional project, which has taken place at 4 different institutions and with 6 different researchers being part of the team. It has looked at the experience of disabled academics, and it is still an ongoing project. At this point, I'd like to acknowledge Associate Professor Heidi Lawrence from the University of Johannesburg, who's the primary investigator on this project and who's given me permission to share some of the findings here today. The second project was a small-scale undergraduate project conducted at the University of the Witwatersrand, exploring the experiences of disabled students. I'd like to acknowledge Ms. Natalie Shaw, who conducted the research project under my supervision. Neither of these projects set out to explore experiences in relation to COVID specifically. However, given the challenges and changes that have occurred over the last 2 years, COVID-19 certainly did emerge as a prominent theme. Both projects employed qualitative designs underpinned by naturalistic inquiry, and with both projects going through ethics committees at the various universities. A combination of remote and face-to-face interviews were conducted, and data were analyzed using thematic analysis. In today's presentation, I've used pseudonyms to protect the anonymity of the participants. So taking a look at the participants who took part in these projects, in total, today's presentation includes the voices of 21 participants. In the project exploring experiences of disabled academics, 15 interviews were conducted at 4 universities with representation at the level of lecturer, senior lecturer, associate professor, and full professor. 9 participants presented with sensory impairments, 3 of whom had hearing impairments and 6 had visual impairments. 4 participants presented with physical impairments. 1 participant presented with a combination of a physical and a communication impairment, and 1 presented with a psychosocial impairment. In relation to the project with disabled students, 6 interviews were conducted, 4 with postgraduate students and 2 with undergraduate students. 2 participants presented with physical disabilities, 2 participants presented with learning disabilities, 1 presented with a sensory disability in the form of a visual impairment, and 1 presented with a combination of physical and learning disabilities. Across both projects, we had representation across various faculties, as well as representation in terms of gender and race. Having a look at some of the findings. Findings naturally revealed a variety of experience amongst disabled staff and students as a consequence of COVID-19. The majority of the experiences could be defined as negative, although a number of positive experiences emerged too. While many of the themes may ring true for non-disabled academics and students, it appears that COVID-19 had a far greater impact on the lives of people with disabilities. Participants' overriding themes included an increased exposure to ableism and the emergence of sudden opportunities. In terms of the increased exposure to ableism, this was defined by a sense of isolation and a sense of feeling unseen, inaccessibility of online training, teaching and learning, lack of assistance and increased reliance on favors, and increased demands on time. With regards to the emergence of sudden opportunities, participants expressed a sense of evening out of the playing field and improved accessibility. Let's take a look at some of these themes in a little bit more detail. While COVID-19 has had a significant impact on mental health amongst many people, and while the experience of isolation, marginalization, and loneliness are not uncommon themes in the disability literature, a sense of isolation and feeling unseen emerged strongly in relation to the move towards online teaching and learning. This can be seen where Sarah, a senior lecturer with a visual impairment, said, "In the end, I just stopped attending meetings and training. It's like I've been at this university a long time and everybody knows I'm blind, but then documents don't get shared ahead of time. And when they are shared, they're shared on a screen that I can't see. I just thought they know I'm here and they don't care. It doesn't feel good to be purposefully excluded. So for my own sanity, I chose to withdraw from these situations." Similarly, Warren, a postgraduate student with a learning impairment, said, "Since moving online, they would just ignore me. I felt invisible. I felt like I wasn't there." And Tembi, a postgraduate student with a physical impairment, said, "I'm not expecting special treatment, but I am expecting understanding. I'm expecting empathy. I'm expecting you to see that this is not easy for me." The move to online teaching and learning was a new challenge for many academic staff and students, and was influenced by previous teaching pedagogies, computer literacy skills, access to devices, and access to data. Many participants suggested that online platforms were not disability friendly, and that challenges such as being unable to use a cursor or to navigate a screen were not well supported. Nick, a lecturer with a visual impairment, said, "Going to online training sessions, it's impossible. I can't see what other people are seeing, and I can't move my cursor around, and I can't type. I eventually found that it's easier to not go to these things and then maybe just pick up a couple of things from my colleagues at a later stage." Stephen, a postgraduate student with a visual impairment, said, "Figuring out how to mute and unmute, that was quite a mission. So the lecturer would just switch me off because I'd get a message on my screen to say your microphone is off, please turn it off, is on, please turn it off. And then there'd be silence because I wouldn't know how to turn it off. So he would just cut me off. But once he cut me off, if I had a question, I couldn't turn it back on. Selma, an undergraduate student with a learning impairments, spoke about the voice-over PowerPoint presentations, where she said some lecturers would only do voice-over PowerPoint presentations, and I couldn't see their lips. I couldn't see what they were saying. I don't want to be spoon-fed, but I do need content in a way that I can grasp. It is well recognized in the literature that people with disabilities frequently have to rely on favors in order to access basic rights. In academia, these favors can result in uncomfortable relationships and can negatively impact the way in which disabled people carry out their jobs. Nick said, the department secretary was really trying to help me. She was even coming to my house once or twice a week to assist with online things. But it's difficult for her because, you know, she can't put in a petrol claim for coming to help me. The university won't support that. And where Tanya, an associate professor with a physical impairment, said, I think the university is quite happy to deal with disability as long as they don't have to deal with disability. Selma, an undergraduate student, said, that was why I want them to come up with a blanket rule about extra time, just so I don't have to keep asking. With online exams, each lecturer expects you to request independently, and they don't all have the same approach to reasonable accommodation. It's kind of demoralizing to constantly have to request something. Both staff and students felt that the move to online teaching and learning required more time out of their day and had a negative effect on the quality of their work. For Lunga, a deaf lecturer, the process of creating and delivering content was long and laborious without any recognition from the university as to the additional time and effort that was required. Lunga said, so for me, it takes long to create material. I have to write it on my own. Then I'll send an email to someone who'll assist with the editing of my English. That person will then edit it for me, and then I change it a bit. I send it back to them asking, why did you write it this way? I didn't mean it like this. I meant it another way. And then they redo it. So it's a lot of back and forth before a simple email can be sent or before a class could be taught. Nick also said, how can I possibly, provide the same sort of output as someone who is sighted and reads emails, can switch between a number of different tasks, all of that kind of stuff. And with the university holding me to the same sort of yardstick without an acknowledgement of how hard it is. Tembi, a postgraduate student, said, I'm finding that it's taking a lot longer to get through work because even my readings are not in a booklet anymore. They're online. It's just everything takes so much longer. While many participants detailed extreme challenges that the pandemic and the move to online teaching and learning had on the experiences of academia, a number of participants highlighted the positive impact of the pandemic and the move to online teaching and learning in the form of the emergence of sudden possibilities. The most significant positive experience appeared to be a sense of evening out of the playing field, where disabled academics were for the first time experiencing the same type of challenges that people with disabilities have experienced all along. This was seen where Martha said, one of the things I'm very aware of as a visually impaired person is that I cannot read a room in the same way that a sighted person can. And all of a sudden, with everybody being thrown into this bizarre world, nobody can read a room. So in some ways, I found COVID to be an equalizer. Many of the privileges that COVID took away were privileges I did not have in the first place. And a full professor with a visual impairment spoke about the positive impact that the move to online teaching had on her. Specifically, where she said, And I was the only one in the department who wasn't terrified of using online technologies because I've been dependent on them for a long time. This meant I was in a position to support staff in the department as I didn't have the same anxiety they experienced. Tembi also spoke about how disclosure was no longer such a challenge for her, where she said, when we were in contact time, everybody could see I looked different and I had to figure out how much to disclose. It's complicated because you don't want people to treat you differently, but at the same time, you do want to be treated a bit differently as well. It was very challenging and I found myself becoming quite emotional. But now with online, I find it better that people can't see me and judge me. I just focus on my work. For many participants, accessibility seemed to be improved as a consequence of moving online. Matthew, a lecturer with a hearing impairment, said, for me, moving online removed the source of my difficulty. When I had to lecture in person, I couldn't take questions because I couldn't hear at the back of the guys at the back of the classroom. But now when I lecture on Zoom, as long as they're speaking clearly, it's fine. There is no back or front of the classroom anymore, and no acoustic problems. Sarah also said, something I became very aware of now that we've moved onto Zoom and Teams age, is that it's much easier for me to get around campus because I do so virtually. For Warren, a postgraduate student, he found that the experience was less anxiety-provoking. And for Nantle, an undergraduate student, she also found accessibility was improved, where she said, it's at your own pace, and you don't have to be constantly fighting for doors to be opened. While the findings that I've presented are from a relatively small cohort of studies and are not necessarily generalizable, I think that there are some important lessons to be learned and some important considerations which we need to take into consideration as we plan for teaching and learning going forward. While the hybrid and high-flex models stress the need for individuals to address individual needs of students within the classroom, we need to ask ourselves whether the needs of disabled people are also being taken into consideration. Teaching models need to extend beyond the need for data and devices, but need to also accommodate and focus on both different teaching and different learning styles. The role of disability in ensuring equality in teaching and learning warrants far greater consideration, and non-disabled lecturers need to take a close look at the ways in which their teaching pedagogies and communication styles may be viewed as exclusionary. Finally, much can be learned from disabled lecturers and students in terms of flexibility, perseverance, and time management. Thank you.
Hello. That was wonderful. Thank you so very, very much, Joanne. I've been scribbling notes as you've been writing, and I think that was a really, really interesting presentation. Do we have any questions from our audience? I don't see anything in the chat. My guess is that people have been reflecting, probably nodding along. Oh, we've got a question there from Stanis. Would you like to turn your camera on and ask a question, Stanis? And then I see Lisa. So let's take Stanis and then Lisa.
Hi, everyone. My name is Stanis. I'm from Boyne Community School in secondary, and I'm 14 years old. I have a question. I heard that lovely, you know, you put it on, and I just have a question. What do you think would be good to improve the problems of the, you know, the people who have disability?
Oh, go ahead, John, if you...
Lorraine, shall I go ahead and answer that? Thank you so much for your question, Stanis. You know, I don't think there's an easy answer to this, but I think as a starting point, we need to have far greater representation from both disabled staff and students when it comes to decision making. If I speak about what's happened certainly in the South African context and what I've seen in my own institution, as well as in the projects I've been involved in, a lot of the decisions are made not taking disabled people into consideration, and we see that, for example, with the example of the student who just got muted and then couldn't rejoin the conversation, and that's such an important consideration. But I don't think the universities have really engaged with the impact of disability on teaching and learning. We've had a lot of engagement about online and blended learning and how those may or may not work, but without considering how those would work for or against staff or students with disabilities. So I think as a starting point to have a louder voice from those communities.
Yeah, I absolutely agree.
Thank you, Janice, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Lisa, you have your hand up there.
Thank you very much. So thank you to you guys at Trinity for organising this, and Joanna, thanks. That was a really interesting presentation. I'm a professor of European disability law at Maastricht University in the Netherlands, and I also have a disability. So a lot of the things that you were talking about, Joanna, were really resonating with me. And there was one quote which I wrote down, which I think was quite, it said a lot of things to me. I think the university is quite happy to deal with disability as long as it doesn't have to deal with disability. And I thought, yeah, that's exactly right. I wanted to ask you about recruiting the academics for the study. Was it difficult to recruit academics? And I ask this because it can, depending on whether you're working in a safe environment or not, and many of us aren't working in a safe environment, that the tendency is not to self-identify and not to come out. So I'm wondering whether it was difficult for you to recruit the participants. And my second question is, in terms of the characteristics of the participants, did you find that you were able to attract or engage with academics who had invisible as well as visible disabilities, or was it more likely that the academics with visible disabilities would come forward and talk to you, but the academics with invisible disabilities, which I think experience to some extent different challenges from academics with visible disabilities, were they represented as well? Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you so much for your question, and I think two very important questions there. I mean, firstly, on the recruitment of participants, the project that's been done, led by Heidi Lawrence, at least 50% of the researchers on that project are disabled academics. So I think, where they were speaking to people who knew them and knew of their work, it was a little bit easier to get buy-in from participants, but also obviously just following the university protocols for approaching participants. Not all of the participants knew that there was a sample of disabled academics who were running with the project. So the sample size was small, considering it was across 4 institutions, and at this point we've only got 21 participants. And every time we met, we said, well, where are the disabled academics, and why aren't they coming forward? And there seemed to be a great sense that these projects have run in the past, but nothing actually really comes of them in terms of difference to the lived experiences of people with disabilities. So that was a challenge, and I think the one with the undergraduate student, or the student project. Also, we did experience some challenges with recruiting participants, and mostly used snowball sampling in the end. And I think one of the challenges was maybe it didn't feel like a safe space. But secondly, also, I think with the challenges imposed by the pandemic and the additional demands on time, I don't think participation in research projects was necessarily high on the list of priorities. So, yeah, it was for both projects. It was challenging. And sorry, you did have a second question.
Yes, my second
It's gone
question
out of
was
my mind.
about the representation of staff and students with visible compared to invisible disabilities.
Yes, definitely far greater representation of people with visible disabilities, and I think we find that quite often. I mean, we did have one participant who had a lecturer with a combination of a communication and a physical disability, and one with a psychosocial disability. But for the rest, they were all sort of visible disabilities. And for the students, there was representation of students with learning disabilities, which are not obviously typically visible, but yeah, greater representation from people with physical disabilities.
Thank you very much, Joanna.
That's superb. I see we have one more question and we have 1 minute for this question and answer. So Rachel Hoare, one of our colleagues here in Trinity, would you like to give a speedy question there to Joanne?
Thanks a million, Lorraine. Thank you, Joanne. I'm the director of the Trinity Inclusive Curriculum Project here, and we're just a year into the project. So I'm very interested in really interesting, rich data there you have, the qualitative data, and it really resonates with a lot of what we found already. So I suppose I had a question which is really related to what Lisa asked. So you probably addressed that around mental health, whether people were willing to come forward and participate who had mental health difficulties, and you mentioned psychosocial there, so I presume that's probably what you're talking about. But the other question is something we're grappling with is basically, how are you going to make sure that this makes a difference? How are you going to be able to embed it into policies? Is it just about raising awareness? I know the project isn't finished, but that's something, it's a massive question. I don't expect an answer, but any nuggets would be gratefully received.
Just very briefly, because I know we're out of time, at the moment we're actually doing an interinstitutional policy analysis of policies pertaining to disability, and even that has been frightening because some of them have been really difficult to find and to access. And at most of our universities we also have what we call transformation offices, which typically don't focus a lot on disability, but focus on other aspects of transformation. But we are liaising with them as well as with HR, just in terms of employment processes, interview processes, disclosure of a disability prior to applying for a post, all of those types of things, which are very challenging and very nuanced. Unfortunately, I don't think we're going to have any quick solution, but I'm hoping that this project, being an interinstitutional project, will have a little bit more power to influence some of these difficult things.
Brilliant. Thanks very much.
Thank you. That is just super. Joanne, thank you so very much. You can see there's a lot of interest. I know that there's another question in the chat, so I can invite you maybe to respond there in your time, but I know everybody will join with me in saying a big thank you. Let me now move then, and it's good there are some lovely happy thank yous there. Let me now move to welcome our next presenter. Our next presenter is Dr. John Henner, who has joined us at what is the crack of dawn his time. John, I know we have made you probably wake up every hour on the hour last night, so you didn't miss your early bird call. John is an assistant professor in the School of Education at the University of North Carolina in Greensboro, and his work focuses on how different factors impact the development of language and cognitive skills in deaf and hard of hearing people. He looks at how to best assess and measure language skills of deaf and hard of hearing populations. And he also examines the experiences that deaf academics have in academia and how scientists interact with deaf people. But today he is going to talk with us about a topic he calls the mask of benevolence, deaf people as a political device during COVID. And John, I can't tell you how happy I am to welcome you to our little Zoom room, and a very, very warm welcome notionally to Ireland. Over to you.
Okay, I will share my screen now. One moment. Apologies for the delayed start. I had a notification that popped up on my screen. I'd like to explain a little bit about my topic this morning. There is an American publication book that was written, I want to say about 30 years ago, called The Mask of Benevolence, and it focuses on how hearing people support deaf folks, but really in the guise of another form of oppression. And so I felt like that was applicable today, plus the pun of masks, since masks are such a part of our society with COVID-19. So that is the title of my presentation today. Just so that you know, it is appropriate in deaf culture to open a slide and allow time for people to read the slide before I start to lecture on it. So if you see me pause at the start of a new slide, you know that's the reason why. Hearing people usually will pop up a new slide and start talking about it immediately, but deaf people aren't able to access the written text as well as seeing the visual information. So we usually add that pause for access. The theory of framework that I will be discussing today is cryptlinguistics. I am working with Professor Octavian Robinson, who is a professor at Gallaudet University, and we have developed this theory together. Cryptlinguistics looks in three different frames. It is an inclusion of disability study, the deaf studies, and we form a foundation here. The first essential truth is that language is not inherently distorted, although impairments may exist. It is important to recognize that the language itself is not disordered. Secondly, that society's perceptions of disabilities is what brings disorder to language. And thirdly, what we think about disability cannot be separated from the normative expectations of language. These normative expectations of language build a box that we are supposed to exist inside of, and for people who exist outside of that box, they are categorized as different. I want to start focusing on our third point today. People have a very specific expectation of how language should be used, and anything that is deviant from that is considered broken. The system is not looked at, but the individual is looked at as being broken and non-normative. This is not necessarily an issue that we focus on only in COVID-19. It has existed prior and will consist after the pandemic. But the assumption that speech and listening languages are paramount means that those who do not use those language modalities are excluded from society. If you cannot speak well, then you need to focus on improving your spoken abilities and your listening abilities. There is documentation throughout the years of different modalities of language. Modalities are simply different ways to communicate, and there is a plethora of them. Multimodal means that how we communicate is not limited to only listening and spoken language. Even those who use spoken language also use gestures. They use body movements. They might draw in the air. They might use pictures to communicate. All of this is considered multimodal, but within education and within therapy, spoken language is taken precedence over all other forms of communication. Within deaf education, listening and spoken languages have become a moral issue, meaning that if you cannot produce spoken language, then you have, in essence, failed the morality test. You are perceived as good if you can speak and not good if you cannot. Other modalities of language result in failing that test and failing the education system. There is a perception within education that you must be fixed and you must be able to engage in listening and spoken language. I have two titles of publications on my slide here that basically mean it's okay to look down on others who do not speak. And for those who speak, if they do not speak clearly. Again, I want to emphasize the undertones of morality in this issue. A focus on listening and spoken languages has several consequences. And these consequences have become more apparent during the COVID-19 pandemic. So much of the expectations of deaf people is on speech reading. Because if your ears don't work, well, your eyes are still fine. So you should still try to participate in that normative expectation of listening and spoken language. You should be able to speech read. For many years, there was an expectation that deaf people couldn't give up speech reading. And I want to say that it was maybe, well, here in the US, I will say that there's been a lot of cochlear implant training with audio verbal therapy, where you are told to close your eyes and just practice, focus on what you hear through your implant, and that will improve your ability. Or you might work with a technician who will turn around or cover their mouth and try to speak and force you to listen just with your cochlear implant. You might be able to really enhance the ability to use your implant, but you might still produce non-normative speech. And because of that, you are still looked down upon. Other forms of communication, again, sign language or written language, are not encouraged. There is this hyper focus on spoken language. Now, and I'm not criticizing the authors of these articles. I do want to make that clear. I always feel like I have to mention I'm not trying to attack the person who wrote the article. I'm just disagreeing with the research. Within deaf education, and this pertains globally, there is, again, that emphasis on speech reading. And the goal behind speech reading is to improve literacy. This article points out that there are layers of language. So if you speak well, and if you hear well, then obviously that means that you must be literate. For some people, literacy can be considered a substitution for listening and spoken language. If you cannot speak, if you cannot hear, as long as you can produce good writing and reading skills, then good enough. But this is another form of oppression. And it's important to recognize that there is diversity in literacy skills across all populations. The amount that we pick on and look down on deaf literacy skills is an attribution of not only ableism, but also racism and other problematic systemic issues. When we teach literacy as paramount because it is our best substitution for listening and spoken languages, we are still failing in our vision for proper and holistic education. And COVID-19, again, has shown the prevalence of that issue, especially in the deaf community. Well, if you can't hear, at least we can focus on improving your speech ability. So what has changed throughout the pandemic? One thing that I have noticed over the past few years, it's interesting living here in the US because COVID has become quite the politically controversial issue. There has been prevalence of the political aspects in other countries. I know that there has been some discussion in the UK, but the US is on a different level. People really have fought against mask mandates, and they tend to use deaf people as a scapegoat, as a reason to not mask. For me, this is interesting because in the 40 plus years that I have been on this earth, I have never noticed so many people attempt to support the deaf community. Automatically, my needs are very important when in actuality, they were never important to you before masks became an issue. Why are people now suddenly so concerned about my ability to read lips? People never cared about my accessibility before. I started to wonder what actually is happening behind the scenes here. Within deaf education, there has been a long-standing emphasis on speech. You must learn to speak. You must learn to listen the best you can. You must learn to integrate in society the best way you can to pass in a mainstream setting. And if you are not able to, well, then you must be a good deaf person with good speech reading abilities and good literacy skills. To believe that if a deaf person can't speak, but they can at least read and write, then they can pass the test. We see that this is not true. We can simply look at employment records to see that literacy skills has no impact to change the perception of disability in society. There is so much focus on speech and listening skills that other types of skills, other types of interaction and communication and things that those people bring to the table are just not considered. Culturally, that means if you do not speak English, we don't know what to do with you. Here in the United States, there's been a lot of abuse experienced by people who do not produce appropriate, if you will, English, both within employment fields and within the education system. If you don't speak and you use another type of communication, say you use American Sign Language or you use ACC, you use pictures to communicate, then you are not as human as other people. Deaf education has spent so much time and energy focusing on literacy and focusing on listening and spoken languages that other ways to engage with the world have fallen by the wayside. In America, in theory, we have the Americans with Disabilities Act. We also have Section 504. But compliance is not really the spirit of what is trying to be accomplished by these laws. People's instinct for accommodations is to pull down the mask to communicate. But if we are using that as our best form of access, you are constantly exposing me to COVID-19 because you are unmasking in front of me. We see even here that speech is taking priority over people's health and safety. As much as I have noticed now in what, the second year? Are we almost to the third year? It's been a long time of COVID-19. Most people genuinely don't care about the needs of the disabled community. They use that as a means to their own gain. If they truly cared about people with disabilities and those disability needs, then they would advocate for better resources or better funding or better access to sign language or so many other things that we could use to actually improve what our communities need. But instead, people just use it as a means to, oh, I don't want to wear my mask. And oh, if you're a deaf person and you can't read my lips, what will we do? That means I just have to take my mask off for you. So with the mask debate aside, what do we actually need? I'd like to share a bit of a story with you. 20 years ago, I went to a deaf club. And even 20 years ago, deaf clubs here we still had several, although deaf clubs were starting to close down. 20 years later, I can say that all of the deaf clubs have since closed. But 20 years ago, there were a few that were still going, and I attended. And I was interacting with some older deaf people. And I don't remember exactly what happened, but I needed a pencil for something. And so I asked, hey, does anyone have a pencil? And the older woman looked at me and said, oh, you're deaf. And I was confused. I said, what does that have to do with it? Yes. And she said, oh, you're deaf. You're in a deaf club. Why would we have pencils? And I paused to think. In that woman's generation, pencils were only used for writing back and forth with hearing people. Deaf people always had to be ready to use a pen and paper to communicate in society. I'm not sure if people still carry pens or pencils with them, but nowadays we have phones, right? And I use many different apps for the purpose of speech to text. It is not perfect, but it works good enough to get by in certain situations. Now, I might come across a bit as a scary person. I know this about myself. I weigh about 230 pounds. I'm tattooed. Most people are willing to accept my accommodations. But I have found out that my experience is not a common experience. Many people want accommodations, but don't have access to them. They are not granted the accommodations that they ask for. So we need a cultural shift. We need more acceptance of different forms of communication. We need these kinds of apps, speech to text apps, to be used more readily in society and to be more acceptable. I'm sorry, has my time run out, Lorraine? Okay, it seems like my time has run close to the end. I will wrap up in just a moment. I'll try to make a quick point here. If we can reduce the emphasis on listening in spoken language, and we can emphasize more on languaging and interacting in society, we can see a system where people become more flexible with the needs of disabled individuals. Quick second to read over that slide. I'm almost done. Instead of what we need, we have things based on the mouth and lip reading. We need system change for multimodality, and we haven't had any of that. Okay, and this brings us to the end. That was my ultra summarized version of the last few slides of my PowerPoint. With masks here to stay, how will we change in the future? Over to you, Lorraine.
That was great. Thanks very much. I'm going to be a little bit cheeky as the chair. I'm going to ask a couple of questions, if that's okay. So just looking at the presentation, I was just thinking about, in general society, how can we relate that within the university? So the lesson you were teaching us there about general society, how can we relate that to the university? What can we do to change and to become more accessible and more inclusive in accepting different modalities of communication? What's your recommendation or your advice around that?
When it comes to a university level, most of these issues are still present. Accommodations, hearing people out with disabilities, professors use masks. That means that students or other people cannot speech read. We want the professors to remove their mask. So that's the assumption that the professors don't have these other accommodations in place. So why, again, is this a systemic issue when we're trying to make it an individual problem? It really is a system issue. So the question is, why is speech reading so important that we now have to risk each other's lives? What other accommodations are possible? Could we possibly use CART, which is captioning services? Could we use sign language interpreters? So finding different things to use, and also along with the laws, I guess it depends on where you live. Like here in the US, we have CART. And I know sometimes we just have maybe one or two certified CART providers. We have to look, outside of our local areas to find these accommodations. We're also seeing things like more live captioning via Zoom based, which is the artificial intelligence, and it's not always a perfect system. So nothing's always perfect. We're also finding more issues virtually with online instruction. Parts of lectures are still being overlooked because they're so auditorily and speech-based. So because people are requiring things to be done in Zoom. So there's also some breakdown in communication in those avenues. We also have to think in instruction in different modalities. When you're talking about face-to-face, different accommodations, everything focuses on the limitations of communication, and we have to figure out how to break through that. The expectation of the individual to change versus the expectation of the system to change is what we need to look at.
That's great, thank you. So I'm just wondering if anyone else has any questions or comments. I know some of my deaf colleagues are here today as well, so I'm just wondering if you have any your own ideas or your own thought perspective that you'd like to share in the conversation. Yeah, go ahead, Stannis.
Stannis, go ahead.
Okay, sorry. My idea is for this project is to put it on the surface, make articles and put it on the TV so people can, you know, see the idea about, you know, and put this into the surface of the internet so everybody can know about the news of the problems and, you know, and the situations, so we can like put them on YouTube or any type of social media about it, or like, you know, articles.
Thank you. That's good point. But I think John is also suggesting that we go beyond where we have been. So, John, I have another question for you. You know, how do we radically change the system? How do we avoid hierarchies of normalization? So I think that's, to me, you know, watching you present this morning, that's some of what we're seeing. We're seeing these hierarchies of normalization. So what would a reimagined system look like? Just a little question.
Well, it seems like it's a twofold question. So what it would look like in a perfect world versus how we normalize it, correct?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well,
I guess in a perfect world, what that would look like would be the care and the work that we do, meaning serving the individuals and making sure we totally understand what it is that they need. With the information and having that dialogue about the different modalities and what can be used. How we get there, I have no idea. But we can repair the work and do the feedback. That's always a question of funding. There's always the question of prioritization. Being anti-biased in education. For example, if I were to say, everything's going online, everything's virtual, that's a different way of accessing information. Great, but okay, if we have some students who don't have computers or devices at home,
mm-hmm.
What does that, you know, do? There's lots of different structures within the hierarchy that needs to be addressed. And I don't have the perfect solution.
That's great, and thank you very much for starting that conversation. And hopefully, you know, that discourse will continue and we can keep on discussing it. And again, thank you so much for getting up at the crack of dawn this morning. We really, really appreciate that. So thank you.
Okay then. Thank you again, John. We really, really appreciate it. Moving along rapidly, my goodness, there isn't enough time to have the level and depth of conversation that we might want to do. If you were here in person, we'd drag you across to a coffee shop or a pub. Well, it's too early in the day for a pub, but we would definitely be bringing you all to have lunch and more chat. But for now, what we need to do is move on to our panel discussion, if we could. And here, what we're going to do is invite reflections from some colleagues here in Trinity. So first up, we are delighted to have with us Courtney McGrath, who is from the Trinity Ability Co-op. So Courtney, over to you.
Thanks, Lorraine, and thanks to the two previous speakers. It has been a really interesting discussion. So I'm just going to discuss, as I am a recent graduate of Trinity, so I'm also a student with disability. I have bilateral cochlear implants. So I'll discuss just about my experiences of doing my final year during COVID, and then also we'll be discussing the Trinity Ability Co-op, which is a group of students with disabilities studying in Trinity, working towards radical inclusion on campus, and their experiences also with online learning. So with my experiences, I actually found online learning probably the best year of learning that I had so far in my time in Trinity, just on the basis that I would rely on lip reading, and as I've only had my cochlear implants, say 5 years at that point, I'm still in the process of still getting used to it, but I'm getting there. But I would find in-person classes, especially in the degree that I was doing business and sociology, which would involve a lot of group discussions, talking in smaller groups, and usually them rooms be quite noisy, and I found it very difficult to jump from listening to one person to the next, and I was missing out. And in some classes, lecturers would have picked people out of the class to answer questions, so person in the back wearing a purple jumper, and them kind of situations would have made me extremely anxious and overthink if I misheard the question or I didn't know it. And especially because my class is so large as well, I also took into consideration it could be quite embarrassing for me to answer the wrong thing. So sometimes I would avoid going to them classes that would pick people out in class, which isn't a great way of doing that. But anyways, when things got moved online and classes started being recorded, I could hear things so much better. And when they did use platforms that included closed captioning, so I had closed caption at the time. I think Zoom didn't at the time, you had to manually put it on, but a platform that we used, Blackboard Collaborate, that didn't have closed captioning. So it was hit or miss, it depended on what the class was, but thankfully I did use assistive technology. So I used Otter AI, which I think is a brilliant tool, and especially if I was rewatching a lecture, had Otter AI, I could transcribe what was being said, so I wasn't missing out. But I also have Note Taker as well, so have been very grateful for the disability service throughout my time in Trinity for that, or I would have missed out on so much. So for me personally, I did quite like online learning. Obviously there was, when I was using platforms that didn't have closed captioning, I did struggle in that sense. So, and then sometimes have to tell the lecturers again and again to turn it on. And yeah, it can, take a lot of time. You know, people will know you as the girl that's always asking to put on closed captions, but sometimes you just have to do them things. But as I mentioned before about the Trinity Ability Co-op, so as I said, it's a group of students with disabilities, and we were founded in May 2020, which is at the start of the pandemic. And so all of our meetings that we had were online, and one of our first main projects was basically students' experiences with online learning and exams. So we did a YouTube video and we put that up in June. So that I think we had just finished exams, or we had just finished exams at that point. And it was just reflections of how it went. So I would have mentioned that, you know, I did actually find the online platforms quite useful. I did find having extra, like a longer extended time to do assignments quite good too, just in the sense that you actually were delivering good quality work, and it wasn't doing something very quick in a few hours. But there was also people with different disability types also in the video. So there was a student that had anxiety, and they found that doing online learning was quite stressful, because there was a lack of clarity about what was going on or how things would be graded if things were online. And there was just a lack of communication at some points during the pandemic from lecturers or from the college. But as we are aware, that everybody was kind of up in the air what was actually going on. So, and then there was also importantly a student that has a physical disability, and they were saying that how come that it had taken up the pandemic for students with disabilities that needs to be taken into account. And I think that was really important and really powerful. So I'm actually gonna go, I think that's it for, I say we're tight with time, but I'm going to just send on the link into the chat of that video if you are interested in watching it. But yeah, thanks so much for having me, and I hope you took something from that.
Thank you, Courtney. I know it's super short, but your contributions are always so valuable. We greatly appreciate it. Because we are so tight on time and have so much we want to hear and see about, could I now welcome Jared Gallagher, who is head of the Student Disability Supports and Deputy Director of the Disability Services. Jared, you've got 5 minutes, go for it.
Thanks so much, Lorraine, and I set the clock as well just to make sure we're on time. So it's really great.
Your sound is a little off there, Jared.
Let's see how we're doing. Is that better now? We're good, I think. So it's really great to have an opportunity to talk to you today. So in the interest of full disclosure, I joined Trinity quite recently. So I joined Trinity in September 2021. So I moved jobs and house in the middle of a global pandemic, which was a very stressful experience. So I suppose I'm drawing on my past experience working in another institution, and also what I've learned from the team here in terms of some of the things from a service point of view, what have worked for students. I suppose the first thing that really struck me around COVID and what it meant for people was this need for flexibility. And I think everybody in the country needed to be flexible and change their approach to how we live our lives. So particularly looking at it from an education point of view, we had to be very flexible in how we delivered service to students. And I know within Trinity, the service didn't actually close for one day, and we moved straight into an online environment of working with students, meeting students on Microsoft Teams. And so from that experience, what we actually had was a phase where there was a much more reduction in student appointments, which really was very significant to how we could interact with students. And that was certainly the case in Maynooth University also, where I worked with students previously, was that because it was easy for students to engage with us, they could connect. They could connect with us online through Microsoft Teams, and we could easily engage with them. Now, a sort of a downside to that was that also in an online environment, it can be obviously, as we know, more difficult to connect and engage with people and really see how things are going. And I'm thinking particularly students who would experience maybe anxiety. That was a particular difficulty for students who were in periods of distress and trying to really get a sense of what was going on for students, get to know them and build a rapport in the usual way. And for very many students, particularly in their first year, that was a real challenge, because ordinarily for students where there was a continuing relationship, you knew the student in advance, so it was much more easier to develop that rapport online. Whereas when you're trying to get to know someone in the first time, it's really difficult just to you miss those nuances, the body language in conversation that I think has already been referred to today. I suppose the other thing that I would note is just that piece around adapting reasonable accommodations and whose responsibility is it? And sometimes when we moved so quickly into an online environment, disability was in some ways, it was trying to remind people not to forget about it. And I know that that's something that our current provost is very keen on with the academic staff, to ensure that disability is everybody's business. But when we moved so quickly into the online environment, adapting reasonable accommodations became a particular challenge, to make sure that academic staff were supported to ensure that reasonable accommodations could be put in place. I suppose the other piece around that is the whole idea of building connections with academic staff, and similar to a point that Rachel made earlier, is around that concept of how do you make sure that people are actually implementing the reasonable accommodations we are recommending, and to ensure that it is everybody's business and that it's seen as a right and a responsibility of all staff, as opposed to maybe just the grace and favor approach. But I think just one of the things from this morning's discussion, and I might pause after that, is the whole idea of a disability identity and a positive disability identity on the university campus. And I know that that's really where we're going to, and really building that rapport, building that opportunity for everyone to have a positive disability identity, so that there's an inclusive university community is really where we're going. And I'm going to stop at that.
Thank you so much, Jared, and a very, very warm welcome to Trinity. We're absolutely delighted and feeling very fortunate to have you join our number, and I look forward to getting to meet you some more and having lots of other conversations with you. Thank you for that. Without further ado, let me hand over to our final panelist for the morning. Well, actually, we're now into the afternoon. So last but most certainly not least, it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Rachel Hoare, who is the Academic Programme Director for the Trinity Inclusive Curriculum, or as we call it, Trinity Inc. So Rachel, over to you.
Thanks a million. Thanks very much, Lorraine. Delighted to be part of this today. So my role as the Director of the Trinity Inclusive Curriculum is to, I suppose, try to create an accessible curriculum that supports engagement, representation, action of all students. So obviously students with disabilities are part of that. And I suppose what we're trying to do is to embed the principles of inclusion in all aspects of the academic cycle, across all courses, modules and programs. So just, not too big a task. And what we really want to do as part of that is to really establish Trinity College as a community of belonging and respect for diversity, where all our students feel supported in achieving their goals. So the way we're trying to do this, we've got 4 pillars. We've got an academic pillar where we've recruited school champions in, at the moment, 18 of our 24 schools, and they are inclusivity champions. We've also got, we're looking at trying to embed policies into, the inclusive practices into policies and discourse around college. And we've got a Student as Partners initiative, which involves Trinity students from all walks of life and community, which are commonly maybe underrepresented and other disadvantaged communities, and from across the 9 grounds of equality, so gender, marital status, family, age, disability, sexual orientation, race, religion, membership of the traveller community. And what I wanted to just quickly share with you is something that our student partner, well, as a team, actually, there's a number of us in the team in the EDI unit, and we've recently produced a piece of artwork, which is currently being displayed in a defining disability art exhibition, Understanding Trinity's Stories. So I'm just going to share a couple of pictures with you, because I think this really does illustrate the kind of COVID, how people have been, the good and the bad things that we've taken from COVID. So we're very lucky. We've got a student partner liaison officer, Sean, who's recently graduated himself, and he's working with us, and he's very creative. So we created 2 virus models, I suppose you might call them. One for positive experiences of that students had that COVID had brought positive things, and some of these have already been alluded to by Courtney as well. And so these are the positive things that we were able to represent on our model there, and there's echoes from everybody's presentations actually. So no commute, flexibility, more autonomy, recorded lectures, being able to listen back and provide flexibility. Open book online exams seem to go down very well with the students. Saving of money, more confident in online classes. That was something that we found from our student partners. So all of these, sorry, I should have said that all of this feedback has come from focus groups with our student partners. We have 20 student partners who have come from all different walks of life who work with us on the inclusive curriculum project as part of the student partners kind of pillar. So that was all the positive, and we chose the red virus here, as you probably recognize, there's golf tees stuck in, which on which the messages are hung. So these are the negative feedback that some of our students were giving us. They found it difficult to be motivated. They missed the human contact. A lack of standardization in terms of different lecturers' use of technology and abilities with technology. Variation in lecturers' empathy. Thought that was quite interesting. And I suppose you don't have that opportunity for a chat just before or just after the lecture when a student might kind of, you might take a student back up to your office if they really want to talk about something, or if they're upset. Technical challenges, difficulties engaging, and maybe that they felt that they weren't as prepared. I'm just going to share this whiteboard with you as well. And again, if anybody wants to look at this, because we have very little time here, but this is learning in TCD in Trinity College Dublin. That stands for during COVID-19. So this was the result of our student partners and the kind of things that they came up with, on their challenges and the positive aspects of learning in Trinity College during COVID-19. So I'm just going to pick a few of them to read out, because I'm conscious of time here as well. The one in green here, I've got my cursor. High flex approaches allow students to timetable their own time and energy better, and choosing the option that suits them the most in a certain situation. So I think one thing that came out as a key takeaway was, please have in-person lectures. We love in-person lectures, but life intervenes. We can't always get there. So we would love, it's not that we don't want to be there, sometimes we just can't, and we would love to have the opportunity to listen back to a recording. So just to have that possibility to do, almost like the hybrid model as well. And this is what we were looking at, was, what lessons have we learned from this? How can we incorporate this information, what we've learned in the last 18 months going forward? So, and I suppose in the top left-hand corner, maybe I will finish with that. I haven't got a timer on. Use of hybrid learning is a positive. It reflects universal design for learning and more accessible to everyone. So I think it's great to learn to kind of finish up there on a nice positive note. So thanks a million for listening.
Rachel, thank you so very much. And I just take this opportunity to give a big shout of kudos to everybody on the Trinity Inc. team. You've been doing really, really interesting work. And I know we've got questions in the chat there about the school champions and the student partners. So a big thank you for that. Unfortunately, we are out of time. We don't have time for questions and answers, but I would suggest that this is the beginning of a conversation rather than the end of a conversation. I'd also say that here in Trinity, we're working to develop our new equality, diversity and inclusion strategy. And I know that there are going to be key learnings, and the thoughts that were raised today will certainly inform our ongoing conversations there. It would be remiss if we didn't take a moment to thank all of our presenters. So a big thank you to Joanne, to John, to our panelists, Courtney, Gerard and Rachel. For a few words in Irish, Guramila Mahaguf, 100,000 thanks. And can I also say, you know, that without the work of our wonderful colleagues from the Disability Research Network who organised this morning, this wouldn't have happened. So thank you to Mark Bell, to Michelle Spiritos, to Sarah Kift, to John Bosco Conema, to Adern Garcia Iriarte, to Caroline Jago, and to Declan Riley. And a big thank you to our 4 interpreters, to Stephanie, Joni, Catherine, and Lisa. And I want to thank all of you for taking the time to join with us in this really important and stimulating conversation. As I said, I hope it's one that you're going to continue to engage on with us. As Gerard Gallagher said on our panel discussion, he said, disability is everybody's business. And in the chat, I've seen discussion around tech, with Courtney saying, you know, that a better than nothing approach suggests that there are better ways of doing this. So let's all figure that out together. Let's all do our bit. Let's keep having open, frank conversations and commit to doing better. And in the meantime, from all of us here, we're going to wish you a very happy International Day of Persons with Disabilities 2021. And with that, I will stop. And I don't know if Mark, our convener, or anyone else from the DRN has anything they want to add before we say goodbye.
No, just to say thank you very much to you, Lorraine, for chairing this morning's event, and thanks for so many people for joining us. I'll stop the recording now, and we will be making it available in due course as well. So thanks to everybody for this morning. Goodbye.